is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 726. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how's it going, bud? Welcome back.
Oh, it's going great. We've been jamming. It's been fun.
Yeah, we have. There's been jamming.
You know what's funny is we don't always agree with like the populace on formats, and this is just like another example of that, which is fine. People get to have different opinions. We're just two people. We have our opinions, and I actually like this format quite a bit. I know that's not true of everyone, but I've been really enjoying it. And then like we weren't that high on WoW, and a lot of people seem to like it. So I don't know, it just is what it is. But
yeah,
I like the format.
I've been happy with it too. I think it's totally fine, and yeah, I'm not like super excited, but I'm definitely not down on it. Yeah, I don't know. This one seems like a solid double to me so far. We're gonna talk about what have thus far been the best archetypes in the format, and just give you an overview over each one of them, kind of how they work, maybe some key cards from each, because there has been a bit of a delineation now with regards to how the archetypes have been queued up. And we talked about some of the ones that we were playing early on last week, but we're just going to focus on the ones that have been performing the best for in general for this episode. Before we get into that, though, we want to thank everybody on our Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. You get a thank you card and a sticker in the mail, and Patreon is the place that you can go to support all of your favorite creators, you know, to help them out, make sure that that your favorite stuff keeps coming out and can even expand and do new things and all that kind of thing. So patreon.com/limited resources if you'd like to support us on there. Also, our sponsor, Ultimate Guard, the manufacturers and distributors of the absolute best products when it comes to collecting or caring for your Magic collection. Things like sleeves, deck boxes, backpacks, big deck boxes to hold, you know, multiple commander decks or a cube or something like that. They've got it all, and this is the best stuff on the market. When we were looking around for a sponsor, Ultimate Guard was the first place that we went to them. Like we said, we like your stuff so much and we think you'd be a good fit. Luis has a good history with them as well. And you know, we want to take a product that we can be really proud to stand behind. And that's what we're able to do here with Ultimate Guard. So if you are in the market for some sleeves, check out their katanas. If you need deck boxes, backpacks, anything like that, make sure you check out ultimateguard.com. There's a link in the description as well. Thank you for your sponsorship, Ultimate Guard. We really do appreciate it. Let's just get right into a couple of Crack-A-Packs, Luis, because it is early enough in the format that I'd like to do multiples, just again to kind of get a little pulse on where you and I are at with the format, what we've been up to.
For sure.
So the first one has Hidden Courtyard. That's the white cave. Where are you at on the caves as far as where you pick them?
I honestly don't prioritize them very highly at this point.
You don't have to, right?
Well, it's a combination of, I think, three different things.
Okay.
One is caves and land cyclers overlap a little bit in terms of, hey, this gives you a little bit of flood screw protection, right? Where one is a land that can sack to become a spell later. The other is a big expensive card that can turn into a land early. Now, caves do the job a little bit better because you get to use it as a land until you need the spell, whereas land cyclers force you to choose if you want to get one or the other. But they both kind of have the same thing going on, which is when you have too much or too little mana, these can help you, right?
Right.
The second is that there's a lot of one-drops in the set, and this kind of cuts two ways, which is playing a cave on turn one is actually can be a real cost. Like I've had like a red-blue deck that didn't play a cave because my deck had like 7 one-drops. And like,
yeah.
Sure, you can go like turn one drop, turn two 1-drop cave or whatever. But the second part of this is that you're going to then discover into 1-drops later because your deck's full of 1-drops, and that also makes the caves less appealing.
That's a bad 1-2 punch.
Yeah. So, and then the third is that this format is pretty fast, so I haven't felt the like need for a mana sink quite as severely as in other formats. This isn't to say the caves are bad. It's just to say I don't really prioritize them. There's formats where these would be like really high picks.
Definitely.
I mean, I remember older formats, like we're talking a long time ago, where cycling lands were like something you'd pick third and be like not unhappy about because getting to play 18 land with 3 cycling lands would give you a pretty distinct advantage. Here, if you could add caves like basics, setting aside the caves deck, of course, that breaks there. But if you could add caves as like basics how often would you even go to that well? Yeah, maybe you'd add one or two, but you really wouldn't be.
Yeah. And it does feel
all that stressed about it.
Yeah. And it feels like you get the one or two that you want without having to work for it. So, yeah, which is fine. That's an okay place for these things to land. Next is spring-loaded saw blades. I've actually kind of liked this one.
Love this card.
Yeah, so this is the 1 and a white with flash, and when it ETBs, it does 5 damage to a tap creature an opponent controls, and it's only 2 mana, so you do actually get a pretty nice hit off of it, efficiency wise, and then you can craft it for 3 and a white with an artifact. And it becomes a vehicle that has crew 1 that's a 5/5, and you can tap 2 other untapped artifacts you control to wake it up. So it has like kind of 2 different ways to crew it.
Yeah, the reason I like this card so much is it's just like a pretty good removal spell that turns into a pretty good vehicle. It's just both sides are good. Like, yeah, if you're like super aggressive, you're not always going to want to play a destroy target tap creature sort of deal. But in general, I would say that the spring-loaded saw blades is just, I would play this. I mean, I played this in aggressive decks and it's been totally great. People still attack you,
Yeah, it is interesting how that part of it has become more and more of a thing, because there's Quicksand Whirlpool and spring-loaded saw blades both at common and both just waiting for your attack. So, yes. Definitely take advantage of that if you see an opponent, very obviously leave up mana where they've got 5 cards in hand or something and they could have played something, to be aware that you may be able to strand it, which is a pretty big game. I mean, if you get them on 2 or 3 mana on turn, say 3 or 4 of the game, like that's a lot. Next is Rampaging Spiketail, which is the black land cycler. You mentioned this, how it affects the caves as well. This is the 4 black 5/6, and when ETB is a creature you control gets +2/+0 and indestructible until end of turn. And it's also a dinosaur, by the way, and you can swamp cycle it for 2.
This is, I think, one of the best land cyclers because black is the descend color. So it actually likes just being able to guarantee your descending in the times where you have this and you want to do that. It's still not like, again, a huge priority, but it is a card that I'm very happy with in like blue, black, or black, green. And, it serves a real purpose there. Like, you're getting the normal value of it being a land cycler plus expensive spell with the additional value of this fuels descend on both sides, both triggering descend and your descend 8 cards or whatever. So certainly not a card I'd take early, but it's more of a real card than like the white land cycler, which I strive not to play.
Right. It's also interesting one. I forgot the name of it, but the card that we talked about that's like difficult to transform. You have to do one of each of the main creature types.
Throne of the Grim Captain or whatever. Yeah,
that one. I found that this Rampaging Spiketail is your dinosaur more often than not, because that card goes pretty well in a descend deck where you're getting a lot of those milled in for free or whatever. Next is Runaway Boulder. This is definitely one of the most clever cards that they printed in this set. This is the 6 mana flash artifact, and when it ETBs, it does 6 damage to a creature an opponent controls. But you can bail on the whole thing and cycle it for 2.
Yeah, this one's again kind of cute, where it's like it's good. It triggers descend. It's ups your permanent count, but it's also a removal spell. It's an artifact in your graveyard for cards like Inverted Iceberg or other craft cards. It checks a bunch of boxes. Kind of checks them all poorly, so I'm not prioritizing it, but it's a playable card.
It is. My assessment is that I play it more often than I thought I would, which was 0, but still not very often. Yeah. Next is Ray of Ruin. This is 4 and a black sorcery. Exile target creature, vehicle, or non-basic land, and you scry 1. I mean, if you're in the market,
Yeah, look,
it's just not black a card kind of stinks.
That you're embarrassed to play, where if you have to have this card in your deck for a removal spell, it's okay, but honestly, I try not to play cards like this very often. Like, expensive removal is not something you want a bunch of.
Right. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the blue-red deck and the blue and the white-red deck, both of which can be quite assertive off of one of the better 1-drops we've seen in a while in this format. And a card like Ray of Ruin is kind of embarrassing there. Next is Song of Stupefaction. This is the 1 and a blue aura that enchants a creature or vehicle and gives it -X/-0, where X is the number of permanents in your yard. And when it ETBs, you can mill 2 cards.
Yeah, not a card I'm very impressed with.
No, I have not liked it. Also, blue being a very, very strong color in this format means that mediocre cards like this get pushed down pretty quick. Like there's a lot of better blue commons that end up getting taken over this and played over this. Next is Acrobatic Leap. That's the white instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying until end of turn, and you untap it. They kind of try to give it everything except for that second power that second point of power on it. But I have lost to this card a couple of times when like there was a close game and my opponent was off to a quick start and then they just finished me by top decking an Acrobatic Leap and flying over.
Yeah, it's clearly a playable card in a format with, a lot of early plays and whatnot. But
yeah,
it's not a card I'm spending a lot of effort trying to acquire.
Same. Sunsought Militia. This is the 1 in a red 1/3, and you can tap 2 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control, and it does 1 damage to an opponent, but you can only do this at sorcery speed. This thing does finish the job. I like the card.
Yeah, I'm a fan of this card. It's not always like the most impactful because like if it's bad in a low resource game, like if you mulligan to 6 and this is the card you draw in the early game, it's not always going to be great, that sort of thing. Or right. Like you're playing against a deck with it that kills a bunch of your stuff. But I found this in like red, white, and red, blue to just be awesome. It's not really playable in red, green, and Agreed. Red, black is just kind of not playable in and of itself. But in red, blue, and blue, white, there's just so many trinkets that come into play. And when this thing reliably can do 2 to 3 damage a turn, 2 to 3 unblockable damage a turn with haste, is really good.
Yes. And there's a lot of times where the gameplay scenario plays out such that you look at it and you go, okay, I could tap everything on my board to do 3 to you and get you down to like 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that. And you think, but I am going to get tacked back. But it's like, well, I'm at 16. Like, I'm not going to die. And if they attack me back, I just get to slam on them with all of these creatures. So sometimes if you're far enough ahead, you can just commit to the Sunshot Militia plan, and your opponent, even though you've just completely left the shields down, won't be able to punish you for it. So this is a nice finisher that only costs 2 mana in a really aggressive deck as well. To me, this is like a classic like C+. Like this card does well, it does its job. You just need to know where it slots in. Next is Screaming Phantom. This is the 2 and a black 2/2 flyer, and whenever it attacks you, mill a card.
I like this card in Descend decks.
Sure.
It kind of fills your graveyard. It does the thing you want. Also, I found flyers to be especially good in this format because of Explore. Mm-hmm. Just and equipment. There's a lot of playable equipment.
Yep.
So that more leans towards like blue black that has some map token generation. Like because blue black is interested in the same merfolk that make maps like the Siren and the Scout, but you're not always going to play the Phantom, and it's not a card I'm really like too stressed about getting. Part of the issue I have with it is that it doesn't block very well in a format where you want your creatures to be able to block, because the blue black decks are basically on the back foot from the beginning, and kind of the same with black green.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said, though, it is interesting that like just 1+1/+1 counter, changes so many of these commons from being just okay to being actually very strong. This is one of them. Next is Mineshaft Spider. This is the 3 and a green 3/4 reach, and when it enters a battlefield, you may mill 2 cards. This is a finely statted card with a relevant ETB, but I do have a hard time slotting it in. It feels underpowered for the Dinosaurs deck, for example, and I guess it was supposed to be like a green-black card, but like that isn't really an archetype that seems to be well supported. So even though this card has totally reasonable stats, I find myself struggling a little bit with where its home is.
So actually, this is a card I have in our show notes to talk about.
Okay.
So I'll just talk about it now.
Okay.
This is a excellent card in exactly green-black.
Okay.
Because in green-black, it does 2 really important things. One is it mills you, which is what that deck's trying to do, right? It's descending.
Yep.
And the other is that this is the way you want to beat the 1-drops. You don't want to beat them with removal, but if they have like 2 Miner's Guidewings in play and you play this, like it can be the showstopper. Like this has the stats to really tangle. And not saying that like this card's great, you should third pick it, but it's a card that basically no one else wants because blue-green's just straight up unplayable. You basically shouldn't be in blue-green very often. The red-green decks aren't interested in it. Green-white is also a color combination that I haven't had a whole lot of success with. And even when you do, you want to be aggressive more than putting the spider on it. Like green, white, low curve is totally fine, but spider doesn't fit there. So that's like, oh, green, black, that's its home. It's almost a green, black, gold card, but it's a good one there.
Okay, so that does make sense. Yeah, it's just not quite a fit in the other decks, the ones that are good. Last common is Cavern Stomper. This is the 4 green, 7/7, and when it enters a battlefield, you scry 2. It's also dinosaur, and you can pay 3 and a green to make it so that it can't be blocked with by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. This has actually been a very solid finisher for the green-red dinosaurs deck, which has been one of my favorite decks. It's also one of the decks I've had the most success with. But this thing, you could overlook this as just another 6 mana, big dumb green creature, but it's actually better than that. Scry 2, when you actually play this card, is very, very relevant at that point of the game. Lands are almost worthless, so any land you put to the bottom is almost like drawing a card. And there's usually some you want expensive cards, or you want cards that help you get across the line. And Scry 2 at that point's really good. And then that activated ability comes up way more often than I thought it would. There's a lot of time where your opponent plays that and you're looking and you got a bunch of 2/2s and 1/1s and little junkers, and they just pause for a minute and then activate the Stomper, and you're like, yep, you got it. And you can't do anything about it because it's so big. Plus, there's enough ramp in the Dinos deck, mainly we'll talk about it in a bit, but mainly off the back of the Poison Dart Frog, the PDF, if you will, that you can cast Cavern Stomper a turn early often enough that it's just like far and away the biggest thing on the battlefield.
My initial thoughts on this card were like, it didn't look very good because I don't like paying 6 for things that don't gain you life or otherwise that can pack the board if it dies.
Yeah.
But for all the reasons you said, this card's actually performed quite a bit better than it looked like it was going to. I think the Scry 2 basically guaranteeing you have a good follow-up play is really what does it.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And what I think really happened is that you and I prefer our big dumb green 6-drops to make a token so we can block, or to give us some life so that we can untap with the dang thing. But the Dinosaurs deck is quite assertive. It is applying a lot of pressure. And if you're the one who's ahead and you cast Cavern Stomper, it is the type of card that puts the game away much better than it does get you back into a game you were behind. Next is our first uncommon. It's Ukenbach, the Great Mistake. This is the 3 blue-black 6/4 Vigilance Menace with Descend 8. You can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it if you've got Descend 8 set up.
Yeah, this is a card I actually have come up on as well. It's not it's not a bomb. It's, again, not a card I'm going to take early, but in the blue-black Descend deck, which is the only way I've really found success drafting blue-black at all.
Yeah.
This card is nice because it's a card that just gets played out of your graveyard. So you're doing your thing, you're milling yourself, and then all of a sudden, like, a free card pops in. So you kind of don't want to draw the card. But also, if you have to cast it, 5 mana for these stats with Vigilance and Menace is not the worst. So
yeah.
I wouldn't be looking to take this card here, but it is a decent card.
Yeah, this is a type of card that if you get 6th and you can kind of go, okay, fine, I'll be blue-black Descend, then that's really good.
Right.
Next is Explorer's Cache. This is the 1 and a green artifact, and when it enters a battlefield, it enters a battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter back on the cache, and you can tap this thing to move a counter from the cache to a creature at sorcery speed.
Yeah, this card's cash money. It's actually pretty good.
Is it? Okay, yeah, I have not wanted to fuss with it particularly, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What's the upside? What do I like about it?
Well, basically, you play this, right, and you immediately put a counter on a creature, and then they have to deal with that creature. And if they don't deal with that creature, then you end up in a spot where... Well, I mean, then you're just winning, right? Because you put a counter on that creature, and you put a counter on a different creature. You want to spread them out. And if either of them die, you get a reset. You're getting 3-4 counters out of the same card. Yeah, that really is just not that bad. Yeah, no, that's not too bad. Maybe I'll try it out. I think it's one of those cards that people take a little higher than I do. So if I see it early, I don't take it. Next is Dauntless Dismantler. This is the 1 and a white 1/4. It makes artifacts your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, and you can pay white XX and sacrifice this guy to destroy each artifact with exactly mana value X.
early, I thought it was X or less. And I made a play that was like, oh, I would not have done that. But it blows up exactly that number. It's an annoying card.
This card has been surprisingly good. Like the fact that it makes it so it slows down your artifact opponents, and then you have this like kind of engineered explosive sort of thing in play, which I've had it end up where I couldn't really use it without hurting myself as well, because the white decks tend to play a lot of cheap artifacts. There's not, I guess black-white would be the best home for this that doesn't do that. But 2-mana 1/4 that has like multiple abilities is a good deal.
Yeah. And, we'll talk about the blue-white deck in a minute, but, its overarching themes are flying and artifacts. And if you've ever played a blue-white Flyers deck, you know that a 2-mana 1/4 with any type of ability is that's on the menu. Like, that's a good blocker that can hold off the ground for a while you get it in the air with your slightly more expensive but evasive creatures. So totally fine. And then also the fact that artifacts are pushed quite hard in this set, in the sense that many of the creatures that you end up playing are artifacts or created from an artifact or, something like that. It means that this thing affects more than just, a random utility artifact hitting the board tapped every once in a while. Like, a lot of your opponent's creatures ETB tapped, which is, that can be a big problem if they're on the back foot.
Totally.
Our last card is it's our rare. It's Fabrication Foundry.
Are you sure? It's not grayed out. It doesn't have a red outline.
No.
Did you not play Lost Caverns the first day or two it came out?
No.
This card literally didn't work on Arena. It had like a red outline. It's like, you can't draft this card. This card does not work.
No way. I have never seen that before.
It was like the equivalent of a big red X across it.
That's hilarious.
They fix it, now it works or whatever. I assume. I haven't seen it in a pack for a while, but like, it was just like, this card is not playable.
That's which is also true. It's
also
one
true,
in,
yes.
Yeah, it's 1 and a white for an artifact, and it taps to add white, but you can only spend the mana on artifact spells or abilities and of artifact sources, and then you can pay 2 and a white and tap it and exile 1 or more other artifacts you control with total mana value X, and you can return target artifact card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield at sorcery speed. But this just, you compare this to like an Oaken Siren or something like that, and this thing just falls flat on its face. Like, there's just better ways to get this type of effect that also do other things. Yeah. So what do we want to take out of this pack? I have to say this pack's fairly weak, right? There is nothing that just jumps out. Spring-loaded Saw Blades would be on my list. After our talk, Explorer's Cache would be on my list. I would not first pick Cavern Stomper, even though I do like the card.
Yeah, I would take the Saw Blades. I think white is a better color to start with than green, with Explorer's Cache being, I would take Explorer's Cache over the Stomper to start a draft.
Yeah, like, I would too, just based on cost. I just don't want to first pick a 6-drop, but unless it's really good.
Yeah, but I like the Saw Blades a lot, so I'm just jamming those.
Okay, I think if I open this pack after we recorded this show, I would take Explorer's Cache and try it out, just because, like,
sure,
again,
that's totally reasonable.
All right, another Crack-a-Pack here. Our first card off is Hidden Volcano, which is the red cave. We talked about those. Next is Otaclan Landmark, which is the white. When it ETBs, you scry to, and you can craft it to become the 1/4 flyer or whatever?
1/4 that when it attacks the Levitator, it gives another creature flying.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on the Landmark? Doesn't really do much on the front end.
Well, so I like it. There's this class of artifacts that's like Otaclan Landmark, Orazka Puzzle Gate, Inverted Iceberg, and these are all artifacts that don't affect the board directly, because like I'm not putting them in the same class as like Cogwork Wrestler or the creatures, right? These are artifacts that don't affect the board directly, but what they do is they give you an artifact that chills in play and helps enable all your other artifact stuff. I think this is the weakest of it because you don't get a card out of it. You get a scry too. That's
the problem, I think. But it is very cheap to craft.
Yeah, and it's a decent body when you do. Basically, I see this as a card that you'll put in the decks that want to fill the board with artifacts, but not a card that I'm like, stoked to play or anything like that.
Okay, our next card is actually, at least currently, the best common in the set by games in hand win rate, which is Oltec Cloud Guard. That's the 3 and a white 3/2 flyer that makes a 1/1 artifact guy on the gnome on the ground as well.
Yeah, I mean, this card's really good. It just puts a 3/2 flyer into play, and as we already mentioned, the flyers are pretty good. It also gives you an artifact, so that it helps with those, and it's just 2 cards in 1. Like, this card is excellent. Would not really be unhappy taking it early.
Yeah, and again, we were talking earlier about blue-white, which we'll talk about in a minute, and again, this is perfect, right? Because I said it's a combination of flying and artifacts that gives you both of those, and you get 3 power in the air, plus at the bare minimum, a chump block on the ground that can soak up 4, maybe 5 damage, and allow your Cloud Guard to get in another attack, and that could be the lethal one. This is certainly our pick at this point. Sunfire Torch, this is the red equipment that gives a creature +1/+0 for an equip cost of 1, and when the creature attacks, you can throw the torch at something, at a creature for 2 damage.
Another great card. I wouldn't take it over the flyer, but it is a card that the red, blue, and red, white decks are very happy playing.
Yeah, and it sees a lot of play.
Less so the red, green decks. Like, it is still a card that those decks can play, but it's not a card I'm excited to play in those decks.
Next is Sunshot Militia, which we talked about. Hey, look, it's the other best common in the set, Waterwind Scout. So this is the 2 and a blue 2/2 flyer, and when it ETBs, you get a map token. So again,
Waterwind Scout is awesome.
It's awesome. And it's the same, again, flying plus artifacts, right? You get that whole thing going. And then ideally, you can use your map token on it or another flyer to really pump up that +1/+1 counter if you happen to hit one. So what do you like between Cloud Guard?
I think I would probably take the Scout.
Mm-hmm. I think
too. These cards are very close. I wouldn't fault you. I just like starting blue a little more because blue has both blue, red, and blue, white as, A+ archetypes, and it's still good in blue, black descent, which I personally still like. Whereas the 3/2 flyer is
Cloud Guard. Yeah,
the Cloud Guard is great in red, white, great in blue, white, which is also 2 A+ archetypes, but I don't really like drafting white, green, or white, black that much. So it's very close. You could take either one.
Yeah, I would take the Waterwind Scout. Also, a common tiebreaker, if things get really close, right? Like if all of the things, your experience, the data that you have on the card, the archetypes it can go in, if they're all really close, taking the cheaper card is not a bad metric to use as a tiebreaker. You don't want it to be first on your list, but it can be a good tiebreaker. Another Rampaging Spiketail, that's the Black Land Cycler. There's an Armored Kincaller. This is the 2 and a green 3/3 Dino. And when it ETBs, you can reveal a Dino from your hand, or if you control a Dino already, you gain 3 life. Card's been very solid for me. It's the classic C, filler for the deck, but it does have an important role at that 3 mana slot of being kind of the biggest thing and then also making racing difficult.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the kind of way you also want to deal with those 1/1 flyers or aggro decks out of the red-green deck. Don't try to spend resources killing their 1 mana plays. Play cards like this, which help you win the race.
Yes, they help you win the race, and you can start smashing with them right away after the life gain. Next is a Braid. All right, so we've got 3 of the best commons here, the Cloud Guard, the Scout, and now a Braid as well. The Guard and the Scout have outperformed a Braid, but a Braid's very, very strong. I think the biggest knock on it here is just that I'd rather start off in blue or white than red.
Yeah, far be it from me to say that like this is the day that I'm wanting to take a 3 mana 2/2 flyer over in a Braid, but this is the day. Yeah. I would take either of those cards over a Braid. I just don't think removal spells are really where you want to be here.
Right, that's the thing, is that this is a good removal spell, and it does match up well with the format, and it does perform well. So you're like, well, what's the problem? And it's what Louis said. What if you weren't in the market for that? Like, that's a world that we're not really used to, right? It's like, well, it's limited. I'm always in the market for that, but you're not. And these threats are just better. Next is Quicksand Whirlpool. This is the 5 and a white instant that exiles a creature, but you can pay 2 and a white if the creature is tapped. I like this card. I play this all the time.
Oh, really?
I do. Yeah, it very consistently makes the deck. It makes the cut for me. The first one, and then in some decks like in blue white, I'll play 2 of them, but not.
It's a totally fine card. I don't think it's a bad card. I just don't prioritize it. I don't think it's a card I'm like actively looking for. Look, You do want a removal spell or 2 or 3 in the decks, even the aggressive decks. But what I don't like about this is it's just not that good when you're trying to push through. Like
for red white.
Yeah, for something like red white or blue white. It's a little better in blue white because blue white has more flyers, which puts you in a situation where your flyers attack theirs. It's great against the dinosaur decks. Like that's where it really shines.
Totally.
But not a card I prioritize really.
Okay, interesting. I guess I'm a little higher on it, but next is Hunter's Blowgun. This is the 1 mana equipment. Equip 2, creature gets +1/+1, and the creature has Death Touch as long as it's your turn. Otherwise, it has Reach. I don't play this card.
No,
I hope
I've never run so short on artifacts that this card has made my deck.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not saying that would be a disaster if it did, but it's just worse than all the craft ones, and it's worse than all the creatures. So where does that leave you? You know,
where that leaves me is maybe it is a disaster if it does make it. That's pretty bad.
Well, that's the thing is like they don't make cards that are really like that. I feel like I'm not saying this card's good, and like I just scoped its win rate. I guess it's 51%, so which is like a couple percent lower than a break even card, basically.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. Yeah,
but I don't know. I guess I'm still in the mindset of like there are cards that used to be printed where if you put them in your deck, it's a really bad sign. But this card is just a little weaker than the rest of the cards, which is why has got a worse win rate. But it's clearly not a card that's going to like hurt you a ton if you put it in your deck.
Right. I still think though that, you know, for your purposes, you should calibrate to this is what that is now. Right. Sure. Yeah. Cause it is relative.
We're arguing, you know, or discussing what disaster means in this context.
Right.
It means a card that's going to lower your win rate.
Yeah.
Compared to the other options.
No, it's true though what you said. I mean, the old disasters were like,
have you seen
abject disasters, right? Like
Chimney 4 and a black for a 1/2 flyer. When it dies, they put a card from their hand on top of their deck.
Oh, hey. Yeah. So I totally hear you. Like this is a card you can put in your deck and it will affect the game. Where that wasn't always the case for your worst cards. Uncommons. Pit of Offerings is a cave that ETBs tapped. And when it ETBs, you can exile up to 3 target cards from graveyards. It taps for colorless or it taps for 1 mana of one of the colors that the exiled cards were. I mean, the cave deck just hasn't come together. Yeah, this should be fine. Like, it's just like, I think it's a combination of the caves deck hasn't really come together, so you don't need to prioritize it. And also the Descend deck, you and I actually both like it a little bit, but you know, it's not one of the big 4 archetypes in the field, and you have to know how to draft it. But that means that taking cards like Pit of Offerings to try to hose that occasionally doesn't come up that much.
No, I'm not a big fan of this card. I guess I could see in best of 3 wanting this card for your sideboard.
Yeah, that would be nice. Next is Synapse Necromage. This is the 2 and a black 3/1 fungus wizard. And when it dies, you get a 1/1 black fungus creature token with this creature can't block. I guess this is another black-green card?
Yeah, it's good in black-green.
Sacrifice black-white.
It's good in black-green or black-blue. Or and definitely good in black-white if you have like sacrifice themes.
Okay.
Like, totally solid card. I don't think it's better than taking one of the premium commons, in large part because of, you know, this is where knowing the kind of color like hierarchy works, where first picking a black card is just worse than first picking a blue or white card in this format. Mm-hmm. But on power level, this is not a card I'm unhappy to get 4th or 5th pick.
Next is Volatile Fault. This is another cave. It taps for colorless. You can pay 1 mana, tap it, and sack it to destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls. They go get a basic land and put it on the battlefield, and you get a treasure.
Just completely unplayable outside the cave deck.
Yeah. Our rare is Sentinel of the Nameless City. This is a nice one. It's 2 and a green for a 3/4 vigilance. Creature type is merfolk. It's also warrior and a scout, but it is a merfolk, so it's like vaguely relevant. Obviously, if this was a dinosaur or something, that would be a whole different ballgame. But at any rate, when it enters a battlefield or attacks, you get a map token.
Card is awesome.
Sweet. Yeah, I've played this one twice. It's
just an absurd one.
Yeah, definitely would slam this one out of this pack. And that's over the Cloud Guard, the Scout, and an Abrade. Like, this was a stacked pack. But
this set has like some cards that have absurd win rates. The game in hand win rate of this card is 64%. That's
for Sentinel.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Is it really?
That is comparable to the best card in the set in some sets.
Man, I did not realize it was that. I mean, the cards performed super well for me, but I did not realize it was that high. That's incredible.
I mean, I guess it's like the seventh or eighth most winning card, something like that.
No, so
I guess it's 10th. I guess it's 10th, but also like Bonehorde Dracosaur is still sitting at 71%, or Aklazotz at 69% is like, I mean, it's just funny. I guess, these are just higher than some other sets. I guess there's some of these cards are just really pushed for this particular set.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll definitely take Sentinel there. Okay. Let's break down a couple of these archetypes, specifically the ones that have been performing super well. Blue-white artifacts, or blue-white artifact flyers, if you will, is the first one. The overall game plan for this archetype is you're going to leverage high card quality. And that isn't anything that you need to actually do. It's just a fact that these two colors have very high average card quality, including at the common level. So you're going to get some really nice stuff. You're going to get flyers, which we've mentioned. In fact, we opened the sort of 2 premium ones in our last Crack-A-Pack. And then the artifacts part of it pops up somewhat frequently. But one thing that happens pretty often is that you can use craft with an artifact or craft with whatever to finish the game. There's multiple specifically uncommons, but also commons that are very good at either producing threats or, augmenting the board significantly in the late part of the game. And that's kind of how the game plan plays out, big picture. What do you think?
So the reason I think that these decks have been winning so much, all three of the Jeskai archetypes, is they get to have their good curve, right? And play their good aggressive creatures, put the opponent on the back foot, force them to deal with it. But then once they do, sometimes it's like, all right, I guess on turn 6, I'll craft my inverted iceberg into a 6/6. Now you have to deal with effectively this giant 6/6 that taps down your best blocker or has vigilance if it wants. And it kind of, like, I've played against it kind of feels unfair, where you're like, my black-green deck was like, it staved off the early beats, it killed your thing, it stabilized, and then you just have like a 6/6 and you flip maybe an Oltec signpost or whatever to make the levitating 1/4, and all of a sudden you just lose because you don't have a way to kill a 6/6 that is hard to block. And what these decks get to do is kind of have the best of all worlds, where they can win early or win late. And blue-white, I haven't actually drafted a blue-white deck that didn't have a pretty heavy artifact theme. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how that really comes about, but
I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you just have to, like, you just, the
all the cards make or reference artifacts.
Exactly.
It's not hard to keep the count up. The other thing that this deck, the blue-white deck in particular, has going for it is between like Miner's Guidewing, Oltec Cloud Guard, Waterwind Scout, and Oaken Siren, it's got all these high-quality flyers, which is the perfect place to put Explore.
Totally.
So when you're making map tokens, I just don't know how many games I've finished with a 4/4 Waterwind Scout or like a 3/4 Oaken Siren that just got a couple Explorers. And, you end up in a spot where you're presenting a very strong flying threat in addition to everything else you're doing.
That's right.
The kind of like I think the most premium card for this is basically the 3 flyers are the ones I want the most: the Scout, the Cloud Guard, and the Oaken Siren. And they all kind of just do exactly what this deck is looking for. The cool thing about blue-white is it can also play some of the removal that's less good in red-white, like Cosmium Blast, Quicksand Whirlpool, Spring-Loaded Saw Blades. These are the cards it gets to leverage better because it's got its 4/4 flyer attacking, and then they have to attack you on the ground, and you're like, Cosmium Blast that, Spring-Loaded Saw Blades that, Quicksand Whirlpool that. So
yeah, and we mentioned it before, but this is the format with the most of these at common. Like, if you're looking to attack into blue-white and your thing has 4 toughness or whatever, like, you are definitely in the market for getting snapped off by one of these. Now, you're supposed to be able to leverage that by playing around it and forcing them to strand their mana, but when they're slamming you in the air with a flyer or 2, you can't really do that. The craft end game feels effectively free in this archetype.
Yeah, that's because it is.
Right. It's just, there's always something around. There's a map token. There's a random creature that's an artifact that happened to die. There's an inverted iceberg. There's something that got milled. There's just always something around so that you can just convert that late game mana into a finisher.
I really haven't had the experience very often between Explore and Craft where it's like, I have 6 lands in play and no creatures in play, no cards in hand, and I don't have anything to do, or the board is stalled. you usually have a signpost or an iceberg or
Yeah.
if you're really lucky, a lodestone needle. I love that card. The tap and put 2 stun counters, then it flips into an explore every turn card. Like that one is like one of the best ways to win. Again, it's exactly what this deck is. The tap and put 2 stun counters wins the fast games, and then flipping it to be 1 tap explore wins the long games. So
yep, totally.
I mean, it's just kind of emblematic of these decks in general. Yeah. And I would say that the blue-white deck, it likes its 1-drops just as much as the others, but I think it likes it the least of the 3 because red offers Goblin Tomb Raider most importantly and Sunfire Torch as like hyper aggressive 1-drops. The blue-white deck still wants its 1-drops.
You get Miner's Guidewing, yeah.
Yeah, you get Miner's Guidewing, but like but the thing is like the Oltec Signpost or Orazka Puzzle Gate or Puzzle Door are just those aren't really like playing to the board. This deck is not attacking you for 4 on turn 2, whereas the other deck sometimes does.
Right. Market Gnomes isn't the hammer down on turn 1 either. So
no, but it is a great card though. I'm very happy when I have that card.
Solid card too. Yeah. To me, this is my favorite and best archetype in the format. If you were to allow me to choose what color pair I could draft and get a solid version in, it would be this one. Blue-red is effectively tied for it as far as overall win percent, but for me, I have much more experience and comfort with blue-white artifact flyers, and this is where I'd want to be. There is no shortage of everything that we just talked about here. You just draft these colors and you end up with this stuff. So that's probably my number 1 deck. What about the blue-red deck itself, though? I think I've only drafted it once. I thought I had a really good version of it. I think I got either 4 or 5 wins with it. Remember being a little bit disappointed and haven't really gone back. How would you describe the archetype? You know, this is typically a spells matter type deck, but that's not really the case here, right?
Oh, not in this set. So the blue-red deck actually has a little bit more variation in terms of like what it can do, which I find interesting. So it's got 2 main themes, pirates and artifacts, and those themes certainly overlap a lot. What I have found is the deck is always artifacts, but it's also sometimes pirates.
Okay.
It's one of those conditional statements, right? Where all blue-red decks are artifacts, all pirates decks are blue-red, but not all blue-red decks are pirates.
Yeah. I'm seeing the Venn diagram in my head right now.
Yeah, exactly. So what I mean by that is a card like Oaken Siren is always going to be excellent. Goblin Tomb Raider, I think, it never had a blue-red deck that I even thought about cutting it. I always wanted more of it because it's always hyper aggro. You play as many 1-drops as you can get. And sometimes you have some of the pirate synergies where Captain Storm, the blue-red uncommon that puts a +1/+1 counter on a pirate. I don't even count her as a pirate builder because she's just busted by herself, and enough of the cards are pirates naturally that you don't have to even change how you draft.
Like if she said put a +1/+1 counter on me, it's already great.
Yeah, and it's clearly much better the way she is. Mm-hmm. But cards like Pirate Hat is the most emblematic of like sometimes this card's good enough because it's an artifact that helps pirates, and sometimes it's not. But it's great with like Spyglass Siren and Tomb Raider. Mm-hmm. I mean, just games where you're like turn 1 Tomb Raider, turn 2 Oaken Siren, turn 3 Pirates Hat Equip. Like you're actually like getting some pretty good value out of that because it just helps you churn through your lands because the deck needs like 3 lands in play or whatever.
We've really evolved, Luis. We used to put pants on creatures. Now we put hats on them. Yeah,
it's true. A real good rule of thumb for this is like just take the cheaper card. That's always the case in limited, but it's especially the case here. And as many Goblin Tomb Raiders, Oaken Sirens, and Sunfire Torch, Inverted Iceberg that you can pick up, like the deck just will do its thing naturally. It's like Sunfire Torch is great. It kills their thing. And then now it's an artifact in the graveyard for your Iceberg. A Braid is totally fine here. Atali's Favor is good still here, but we're going to talk more about that in red-green because that's where it really shines. But you just want to kind of play your cheap cards and curve out. Unlucky Drop is good in this deck, but you just don't want to overload on this. This is not a deck where if at the end of it I have like 2 Unlucky Drops and 3 Abrades, I'm like not that stoked. I kind of want to have 2 Abrades and 1 Unlucky Drop because you just want a ton of cheap creatures. Plundering Pirate's great because it's, both a 3/2 pirate and a treasure, so it counts as both. Mm-hmm. The deck also has a lot of kind of cool, like it gets more of the pirate thing when you talk about higher rarity cards, like Breaches, for example, the pirate rare, and you start to care a little more about that. It also has some pirates that can vary in effectiveness, but can be good. Things like the Shipwreck Sentry, the 2-mana 3/3 that can only attack if you played an artifact, or Waylaying Pirates that taps and locks down a creature.
Yep.
Like Waylaying Pirates is actually one of the best ways to interact in this deck.
Yeah,
because
it's a big swing when you get it going.
Well, it's also a removal spell that can attack them.
Yes.
So like you don't end up drawing too many removal spells. And I found this deck actually has a pretty good amount of card flow between things like Iceberg and Pirate Hat, and just you get that like looting going where you end up not really running out of gas because you're often able to just kind of churn through the like lands number 5 and 6 and not run into that. Though Iceberg helps on kind of both ends there because it also gives something to do with those lands. I like blue red a lot. This is the deck I draft the most often.
Okay.
But it also just really depends. Any of the Jeskai colors I'm totally fine with, which kind of moves us into the last deck. We're going to take a little bit more, because last week we talked kind of at a higher level about these decks, but getting a little more into the weeds here. The white-red deck is the first one of these that doesn't actually always have to have an artifact theme. It usually does, and like something like Goblin Tomb Raider is not a card I'm frequently going to cut from that. But it is possible to have Oltec Cloud Guards and Sunshot Militia and Tinker's Tote. So you're making some artifacts without going hard on crafting, because it's missing Inverted Iceberg. That's the best craft card at common. And Lodestone Needle, I think, is one of the best in uncommon. Though Clay-Fired Bricks in red-white is actually excellent too, because red-white goes a little wider than the other colors.
Clay-Fired Bricks is just awesome. Yeah. Yeah,
fantastic card. Red-white is by far the best Sunshot Militia deck because it gets to play Tinker's Tote. Like the combination of those two cards is just like, it's just very difficult for your opponent to deal with. This deck does have enough solid white creatures that it can just play some combat tricks and a good curve and not feel quite as artifacty. Also, losing Oaken Siren out of blue, which the other two decks get to play. Like Oaken Siren is one of the biggest pushes. Between Oaken Siren and Iceberg, the blue-white and blue-red decks are like super artifact focused. White-red sometimes is like, I've got a curve and I've got a lot of artifacts because the set has a lot of artifacts.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't really call it an artifact deck.
I agree. It just ends up being that there's a bunch of them, and then you are trying to, if you can leverage Goblin Tomb Raider, to be as powerful as it can be. A lot of times I've seen these decks have very low curves as well. Like they often curve out to 4. There's not a huge incentive to go beyond that. And I've seen people run 16 lands pretty consistently on these, and then even dip down into the 15 range, where the top end of their curve is like 2 Dynamitons and a Geological Appraiser, or maybe if they got a sweet rare, or something like that. I've seen that happen quite often, that people are willing to lower their curve significantly, because if your curve's really low and you have like a couple of Plundering Pirates and things like that, those can get you over the hump on just dumping your hand onto the battlefield basically, and that's kind of what you're trying to do with this deck. Yeah,
also just to mention, Miner's Guidewing is a premium common for both blue-white and red-white. Because I know you mentioned it earlier, but I want to re-emphasize it. I think it's at its best in red-white, because red also has good ways to pump it. Like you flip an Idol of the Deep King and get a +2/+0. You put Sunfire Torch on it. Like these are ways to really, once you make your flyer into 2 power, that's all. You just need to make it 2 power. It becomes a real thing, and then your opponent has to deal with it.
Yeah, and it's not that hard to do that. That happens actually quite often in the course of normal gameplay as well. Should we talk about Dinos real quick?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Dinos has been my second favorite. It's probably the deck I've drafted the most, but I really like this deck a lot. This is a super classic kind of limited deck. It is aggressive, but not hyper aggressive. It has a ramp sub thing thanks to Poison Dart, Frog, and it has solid low end, really great high end, like we talked about the Colossal whatever guy that we opened. I forgot what it's called now, but the 6-drop, this Cavern Stomper. Yeah, just like at common being like a really nice finisher, especially if it comes down on 5. And I have found that the deck leans on green. You obviously play a bunch of red cards, but some of the premium red commons that you would normally be pretty excited about kind of fall a little bit. Like I don't play Goblin Tomb Raider in this deck, for example. And that's a card that's really sought after for the 2 decks that we just talked about, the blue-red and the white-red. This one kind of doesn't need that one so much, but you get some really nice stuff especially if you can go turn 2 Poison Dart Frog and then start playing 4-drops right away. Pathfinding Axejaw has been really solid. That's the kind of card that, especially if it comes down to turn early, it's just like, dang, like it either draws you a land, which you really want in this deck because you're going to have 5s and 6s that you're going to want to follow up. And if it doesn't, it's a freaking 5/4. It's just huge sitting there, ready to go. Of course, you can use like cards like Huatli's Final Strike. This is the absolute best home for that type of card. And another one that ends up winning a lot of games there's numerous combat tricks that are pretty good, but Staggering Size, that's a +3/+3 and trample one. That thing is a game ender. I mean, you're attacking with 7/7s and 6/6s and 5/4s, and they have to chump at some point, and you just get to slam. I mean, if they chump your 5/4, boom, you're hitting them for 7 if it was a 1/1. I mean, it'll just finish off the game. And then this is also the best at Tully's Favor deck. That card has been a bit of a revelation.
It's not even close.
It's so good in this deck, again, because trample. And then also you can hit some really powerful stuff. I mean, I've had many games where like pre-combat I play a Tully's Favor on like an already pretty big creature. It makes it bigger. It gives them that pseudo evasion. It often unlocks the attack. And then like you'll hit an Armored Kincaller. That's like a freaking 3/3. Like that's,
it probably gains you 3.
And it probably gains you 3 too. That's a huge swing. I mean, that's where your opponents, you can see them just kind of go, oh God, like this is not going well for me, and that happens all the time, in the format. So that's really good. And I've found this deck to be very consistent. You of course get a Braid. You get, I said the other combat tricks like Ancestor's Aid has been super solid too. That's +2/+0 and First Strike. And you get a Treasure. The Treasure's very relevant if it helps you win a combat early to get through a tough blocker. And you get a Treasure and you get to cast one of your 5s or 6s a turn early. You are off to the races. It is really, really good. And then there's some just really nice payoffs too that you can get, especially like at the uncommon level. I really like Earthshaker Dreadmaw. That's a 6-mana 6/6 trample. When it ETBs, you draw a card for each other dino you control. That is also just a game ender. If you have 1 or 2 dinosaurs and you play this card, your opponents are just like, I have to deal with that. Like, the 6/6 trample is already big, and you may be playing it on turn 5 or something. And then if you draw a card or, God forbid, 2 cards off of the thing, it's just like they know they can't come back from that. So I really like this deck a lot. It's a very straightforward game plan. There's nothing fancy about it, but it's all about power, toughness, and getting those things onto the battlefield as quickly as you can.
Normally, this kind of deck that can't compete with the other kinds of decks we're describing. We've had other formats where it's like red-green just gets creamed by blue-white flyers, right? Or blue-white tempo or whatever. The reason I think the Kincaller is actually like the biggest reason why that is not the case here, but also they've started to actually make good creatures, especially like in green, so, and the fight spells have gotten progressively better. Like, Huatli's Final Strike at common, that used to be like an uncommon basically, and the common would be like a sorcery speed fight spell or something.
Exactly.
So this deck can hang with those decks. Yeah, like, Staggering Size, Dreadmaw's Iron uncommon. Like the trample combat tricks are great. Oh, and that's the other thing. They very liberally give out trample. All the big creatures have trample naturally. Favor gives trample. Size gives trample. At uncommon, the Ire gives trample. Like
Stomper has a version of trample where it can't get blocked by the small guys.
I think R&D has correctly kind of sussed out that you should err on the side of too much trample rather than too little, because trample is like, it makes a big creature, kind of like trample over, defeat smaller creatures. Big creatures generally are worse than small creatures in the game of Magic. Like 1-mana 1/1s generally are better than 6-mana 6/6s, just the way the game is designed these days.
That's right.
Trample can kind of even the score a little bit, and I really do like that.
I do too. And green needs a bump, right? They're always looking for an in-flavor way to give green a little bit of a bump, and trample's perfect. So yeah, I love that deck. I highly recommend trying it out. If you can, if you haven't yet. I know it's kind of a dumb deck. It's kind of one that like doesn't make you feel super clever, but it's really solid, and I'd recommend it. A few cards you want to talk about before we take off here, Luis?
Yeah, I have a list here. We've got Adaptive Gem Guard. So that's the 4-mana 3/3 tap 2 creatures or artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Mm-hmm. I like that. I like having 1 or 2 of these in my like blue-white decks, and sometimes blue-red decks, white-red decks, depending on the composition. It's not the best card. I'm not saying you should take this like above all the premium commons, but getting to play what is it? close to like a 4-mana 7/7 after you've spent a little time, adds another element to the deck that sometimes can be really nice. Like it's particularly against red-green. If you can play this and immediately make it a 5/5, sometimes that early in the game, they don't have a big enough creature to fight it. And then next turn, it's like a 7/7 or 8/8. And then at that point, like you really just kind of crush them. So
yeah. And this thing is almost always a 4/4 before they even pass turn back.
yeah, it's hard for that not to be the case.
Yeah.
Bringer of the Last Gift is one of my favorite cards in the set. This is the 8-mana demon vampire that casts Living Death. It exchanges all creatures in play and in graveyards.
Yeah, that's a sweet one.
This one, it actually has a very high win rate, which I was a little surprised by, but it costs 8 mana. It's just if you build around it, this card wins you the game when you cast it almost every single time. Mm-hmm. And it's super fun to build around. This is exactly like if I start with this card, I'm like, I'm going blue-black or black-green. Part of the strength of that is the deck that you need to make this card good also means you draw the card every single game because you just have a bunch of raised deads and mill cards. So it's like really hard to not have access to this by the time you hit 8. So you're kind of building this very themed deck that's like when you get to 8 mana, you win the game. And that is a constraint. If you build around this, it can be good.
I love that. So, yeah, it's also just sweet. It is very easy to read. My opponent kept attacking me with a bunch of 1/1s and stuff. And I'm like, what is going on here? They had no caves. And I'm like, wait a minute. And then they go land play this.
The next two cards are kind of similar. It's Defossilize, which is the 5-mana return a creature from your graveyard to play. It explores twice, and Soul Coil Viper, the 3-mana 2/3 that brings a creature from your graveyard to play.
Reanimator.
The Viper's a lot worse, but they're both cards that I'm very happy playing in these black decks because there's just so many ways to put creatures into your graveyard, whether that's land cycling, whether that's self-mill, that you end up having a lot of good targets for these all the time, and they're very powerful when they do work.
And those are both uncommons, right?
They are uncommons. Mm-hmm. I've just had Reanimator style decks, which is not something that usually happens in Limited.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a cool like new aspect that doesn't come up too often. Like I had a deck that had 2 copies of Defossilize and like 4 land cyclers and a couple of good creatures, and just like frequently you're just casting turn 5, putting the green land cycler into play, and getting a 5/5 and a 3/3 and a double explore.
Yeah,
and that's pretty sweet.
You can't do Bringer off that though, right? Like, and get what you want.
Bringer will be a 6/6 flyer, but it won't do the trigger.
Man, no, it should say except for in Limited. Like if you pull that off in Limited, like you should get it anyway. Go on.
Yeah, that would be sweet. So one of the other things that kind of goes into these green-black style or green-black style decks is Quadi Scavenger. Mm-hmm. The 3-mana 3/2 to send 4. If you have 4 creatures or permanents in your graveyard, you get to get a permanent back to your hand. This is just one of the payoffs for being in this green-black deck, where frequently in the middle of the game, this is just like a backbreaker. You get to cast this, you get a 3/2, and you get your best creature out of your graveyard back into your hand. Obviously, Chupacabra Echo is the place you really want to be. Like that's what drives you into these decks. Kind of like Bringer, not quite as extreme, but it still is like, well, if I find this card, then I'm going to be able to really build around and have a reward. Because what these decks can do, like I had a black green deck that just cast the same Chupacabra like 4 times in the same game.
Yeah, that's gross.
And then that really goes hard.
That is nasty, especially given the archetypes that are winning right now. Like that's really good against all of them.
Mineshaft Spider, we already mentioned. Same with Ukbenbach. And then Roaming Throne is a rare that I kind of wanted to touch on because I've had really good success with the card. It's the 4-mana 4/4 Ward 2. You choose a creature type, it becomes that creature type, and creatures of that type, when they trigger abilities, they trigger twice. So like, besides naming Merfolk for Explore or Spirit for Chupacabra Echo, there's also just I've never had a deck where like I open this card even in pack 3 and I'm not like, okay, I've got a couple things that work with this. Like it always ends up working out.
Yeah, and it's easy to use. You look at your hand, you see what your next play is, right? And you name that, and then you play the stupid thing, and then you play the next stupid thing. Also the fact that it's a 4-mana 4/4 in colorless with Ward 2, that really carries it. You wouldn't be able to play this, just as like a synergy card. It needs to pack its own punch, but it totally does.
Yeah, and I just think it's a great card. Like it's one that you should prioritize higher. It's not a build around in the sense that I'm like, yep, I'm gonna draft this and draft a Roaming Throne deck. It's more like any deck can take this. It's always good.
Yep. I would take it very highly for that reason. It keeps you open, and you're never going to cut it from your deck, basically. It's also eye-opening as to how many cards these days have ETB effects. Like, that is really the standard at this point, and it's less about what the card does on the battlefield and more about what it does when it enters the battlefield. All right, well, try out some of these archetypes. Let me know what you think. I have my eye, Luis, on a white-red defensive deck. All right.
Okay.
Stick with me here.
So some quicksands, some spring-loaded saw blades.
Yes. And then I want to Sunshot Militia people out. That's my idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So artifacts, Sunshot Militia, and then the trio of come at me, bro, style removal spells. So I don't know if that's going to work, but maybe I'll try it if somebody's drafted it. Send me a picture of it. That's going to do it for this episode of the show. If you want to find us on social media, Marshall_LR and Luis's LSV, pretty much everywhere, you can find us. You can find the show and all of its episodes at lrcast.com, including links on the front to our YouTube channel if you want to watch us record, the Patreon if you want to support us, if you want to check out Luis's Twitch stream or his YouTube channel. The links are right there on the front page of lrcast.com as well. We want to thank our sponsor, which is Ultimate Guard. Thanks again for your sponsorship. We really appreciate it, as well as our supporters on Patreon. And with that, we'll see you next week.
So, Marshall, I'm suffering a little bit from success over here.
Oh, you poor thing.
So I as you well know, Tolarian Academy is my favorite card in the cube. Like it's the card I most like. I get the most good brain chemicals when I take Tolarian Academy.
Uh-huh.
It's the card I'm most chanting going into like pack 3.
Uh-huh.
Because I at this point I just draft often. Well, what if I do open Academy?
Right.
And the reason I'm suffering is I beat too many people in our cube drafts with Academy that no one passes me Academy anymore. Not a single time. I did a cube draft this morning, passing to me. The person passing to me took Academy, wasn't playing Academy, just straight up hated Academy, not knowing, like in pack 1, not knowing whether I was Academy or not.
Wow.
I was Academy, as it turns out. I just didn't have the actual Tolarian Academy. But it just, look, past me made future me's life so much harder as a result.
So wait a minute though. Is this bad for you? They all sort of feel compelled to burn the pick?
Well,
like, I know it's a lot less fun, but is you sitting down at the table giving your team, a tiny bump because of this?
So that's what's kind of tricky about it. It's like, yes, on the other hand, on the one hand, it's not bad for me in that if they're just blind hating Academy early in the pack, like when they know they're not Academy or very unlikely to be Academy, that's an advantage, except I was doing that. So
you kind of earned it.
It didn't work out great for me. Overall, it's not a bad thing. They could always have done that. And especially since I know that happens, it actually has reduced the odds that I draft Academy a little bit here.
Yeah.
Like that definitely has happened, but it is the sort of thing where it's like, well, I kind of wish that people let me pass me Academy a little bit more often. So
well, you said overall it's not a bad thing. It's a horrible thing. It's like the worst thing for you.
Look, it's the sort of thing where I can adjust to it. And recently I had a different draft where I was like, well, I could take this like time twister, but you know what? I'm going to take Solitude. I'm going to go different direction than I'm expected to go. And I ended up drafting like a pretty good mono white deck. But just overall, I have run into the unfortunate truth, which is that people respond to the things you do. So it's
how annoying.
I know it's actually, if you think about it, it's like kind of inconsiderate, right? Like that
it really is.
Why don't they just act like NPCs? Instead, they don't.